Hey, it's Carolyn Glick. I'm here again this week in Washington, D.C. at the Center for Security Policy, where we just had a terrific meeting here with the colleagues. And one of my colleagues here at the Center for Security Policy in Washington is my also very good friend, Dave Wurmser. Dave Wurmser is an expert in all things having to do with the Middle East, particularly Israel, Lebanon, U.S.-Israel security relations. And in the past, he was working in the Bush administration. You were Vice President Cheney's?
Yeah, I was a senior advisor for John Bolton at State for 3 years, 2 years. And then after
in the first Bush administration?
Second Bush administration. And then after 2 years, from 2001 to 2003 with Bolton. And after 2003, I was Cheney's senior advisor for the Middle East.
Right. So you were really in the thick of it. And I am really pleased that we get to talk today because it's always important to talk to Dave Wurmser. Again, I'm very lucky. We're very lucky to have him here today. But also because one of your areas of specialty is Lebanon. And we've just seen things heating up with Israel and Lebanon over the past week. Lebanon, Hezbollah shot over 19 missiles into Israeli territory last week. Israel had a few pot shots at Lebanon and then just called it a day and said, oh, look, we've deterred them. Everything is fine. And that's not really the story. And I just wrote my column for Friday's Israel Hayom, where I said basically that what happened last week raises the prospect of war between Israel and Hezbollah and two-front war with Hamas precipitously. And I thought, first of all, do you agree?
No, I fully agree. You actually picked up on something that I'm afraid too many people here, and certainly even in Israel, don't realize. And it's something that you raised first in your article, and then Gershon Cohen raised it yesterday, which is Israel's in a war. Israel's on the edge of a major war. And you can look at Hezbollah, you can look at Hamas. I saw some Israeli security types talking about, oh, you should respond to the missiles with Hamas, not with it doesn't matter. This is all Iran.
Right.
It's all a war with Iran and an encirclement.
Right. And actually, yesterday it was reported that Iran just had the heads of Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Tehran coordinating, and they decided that they have to tighten their security coordination, meaning Iran's control over everything that they do. And obviously the working assumption has to be that the next war, really like the war in 2006, which started in Gaza, that this is going to be a two-front war. And you had a front row seat in the Bush administration during the Second Lebanon War in 2006. And I really think so much of this is related to that war. And so I really want to talk about that. But I actually want to go back because I think that the strategic realities that we face in Lebanon today with Hezbollah effectively controlling the entire country began with Israel's withdrawal from its security zone that it had had from 1984 until 2000 on May 31st, 2000. And everybody in Israel wants to pretend that there was no strategic implications to that. So maybe we can just start with a little prelude to today's events by talking a little bit about your view of what happened with Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon and how it impacted the strategic situation.
Right. Well, I'm glad you raised that, Carolyn. And that, people don't go back that far, but it is really the key turning point. I remember Yossi Beilin, who at the time was very significant foreign policy actor in the Israeli government, in and out of the Israeli government. And he basically said, these South Lebanese army, if we withdraw, they'll collapse. What do we owe them? And there was no understanding about the nature of Arab society. On one level, Arab society is still, various cultures come from where they come from. Arab society, ultimately Islam, it came from the nomadic structure of Arab society, which means that as a tribal leader or as a nomadic leader, your basic objective as a leader is to protect your tribe. That's your role as a leader. And here was Israel, which is viewed in that context, abandoning its ally, the South Lebanese army, and abandoning its own interests and acting weak. And that had a huge implication for Israel regionally. It looked like Israel was crumbling. So I don't think you can separate the
Israel had
perception
a very,
of Israeli weakness.
I think the Israeli left in general, but I think Israelis, the Israeli left specifically, and Yossi Beilin was one of the most important and really destructive thinkers that the Israeli left has produced. He also is the father of the Oslo Accords, which were a strategic disaster. So he, I think, was kind of the avatar of the Israeli left and to a large degree of the Israeli security establishment, which they don't seem to have a clear understanding of just how powerful they are. They think, like children do, that what they do doesn't actually impact anything else, when Israel is actually the gorilla, in the middle of the room, and that's how it's seen. And so we leave a room, everything's messed up, and we think that nobody's going to notice.
Yeah, Israel doesn't understand its own power,
no,
and it doesn't understand the impact of its success on those around them, but also its missteps. And the whole episode that you're focused on here with the 2000 withdrawal, this was a major misstep that created the perception of Israeli, the lack of Israeli power, the lack of Israeli will. I think so much of what happened since 2000 and the inability of Israel essentially to win a war since then is anchored to this perception of weakness and the unwillingness by the Israeli security establishment to understand that there's this tremendous impact on their neighbors negatively for when Israel acts that way.
Well, Arafat saw the withdrawal from Lebanon and said, "Oh, okay, then Israel's falling apart," and launched the terror war in September of that year. Precisely.
It's a major thing. And the Israelis must begin to understand the nature of the region they work in, they live in. And these questions of power are not simply rhetoric. They are real in that region.
How did Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon affect Hezbollah in Lebanon? Where was Hezbollah on May 30th and where was it on June 1st?
Well, from the standpoint of Hezbollah, they made a very simple point, which was, listen, you Arab nationalists, Nasser, Baathists, Yasser Arafat, you waged your wars, you negotiated, but you never, every time you waged war, there was less of Arab territory left. Israel got bigger. And you gave up and you signed with the Zionist enemy because you were so weak. You just delivered failure after failure. We, Hezbollah, well, look at us. We didn't negotiate, we fought, and the Israelis left. We're the first Arab army to shrink Israel. And then Hamas followed soon thereafter by pushing the beginning of the whole process of withdrawals. And the whole way this was cropped in Hamas's internal language was the same.
But that was in 2005.
That was in 2005. But this is a process that set in, is this idea that they successfully threw Islam.
So you think that Hamas's beginning of the mortar fire against Israel, which started at the end of 2000, that was a consequence of the withdrawal from Lebanon?
Exactly.
Okay.
I think you can directly attribute the rise of Hamas's effective strategy to the 2000 withdrawal from
because of course the first suicide bomber was actually in Lebanon in 1982, and then we had the first one after the Oslo Accords in 1994. So we already had suicide bombings.
And it was the same thing. Remember, Israel already withdrew from good chunks of Lebanon before 95, 96. It was this whole idea that they, through their will and Islam and violence.
It was Islam, not Arab nationalism.
Right. It's Islam. It's not Arab.
Did it have an impact on Al-Qaeda, do you think?
Yeah, I think it contributed to this idea in the region that the West, and remember, the view of Israel in the region is not the way Western elites like to look at Israel. We think, oh, the Israelis are their own thing, and we don't like to associate with them because we have to balance our interests.
Right.
For the Israelis, for the Arabs, Israel is nothing more than part of the West. So if we're in the United States not willing to defend Israel, it means we're not willing to defend ourselves. And the result is that when Israel showed itself as weak, and when the United States did in, say, 82, Each affects the other and creates this regional climate that these Western countries don't really have the will to survive.
You know, it's interesting because you're making me think of something that I hadn't thought of before, which was, in 2003, in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister at the time, said to the Bush administration, look, you should be going after Iran. Iraq is a spent force. The sanctions and no-fly zones, they're no longer a threat. And Iraq is really the head of the snake. And for various reasons, the Bush administration decided to go into Iraq instead. But maybe apropos the issue of the decline of Arab nationalism and the rise of Islamism, maybe that reinforced the idea that the United States was afraid to go after Iran, that it wouldn't go to Iran, that it went to the weaker horse, that it went to post-98 Saddam Hussein, with the bombing and the no-fly zones, that they chose him because they were afraid of Iran already back in 2003. Do you think that was a thought that people thought, or did I just think that for the first time?
No, I think it's a thought that began to emerge in the wake of the Iraq War because of our failures. I don't think the Iranians necessarily thought it at first, because right after the war, they were terrified.
Right.
And
you mean right after the fall of Baghdad?
Right after the fall of Baghdad, they were terrified. And the truth is the Iraq War really didn't make sense if it was an Iraq-only war.
Right.
Doesn't mean the United States had to invade Iran necessarily, but the idea that we were going to deal with Iraq and we're done was a huge strategic mistake. Our primary enemy was Iran. And if you looked at Iraq in the context of Syria, Iran, and Iraq, right, and that all three have to end the day without being there anymore as their governments, then it made sense maybe to go there first and there second.
But that wasn't part of the concept of...
No, it wasn't part of Bush's concept. Bush, I don't really understand why he decided to do Iraq in the end. But it wasn't really out of deep strategic a maneuver or understanding.
But actually, I was an embedded reporter with the 3rd Infantry Division at the, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, and shortly thereafter, that was in March, and already in April, Hezbollah started sending operatives into the Shiite South and organizing them, so that they weren't, even if Iran was terrified, they weren't paralyzed. I mean, they immediately sent in operatives and stared undermining.
Well, the opposite. They weren't paralyzed because they understood that the Shiite question in Iraq could kill them. So they knew this was a war to the death. And this is something I think, again, is currently very applicable. We didn't understand in September of 2003 that we were already at war with Iraq. With Iran.
Right.
That this wasn't anymore an Iraq war. This was now a proxy Iran war.
Right. And
that our primary enemy in Iraq was Iran, with Syria playing a very strong supporting role.
So that goes back to Lebanon, because Hezbollah was started, when, like in 1988 or something, it was Amal militia. Imad Mugniyah was in Arafat's 417, and they kind of merged and they became Hezbollah, and their first attack, I think, was on the U.S. Embassy and the French embassies. Is that right? So that was in 82, and then 83 with the Marines and the Israeli paratroopers in Tzur. So, but the Americans never really, or maybe early on they did. I don't know. Did they ever acknowledge that this was an Iranian organization?
I don't think they did, and I don't think even to this day we fully equate Hezbollah with Iran, when in truth it is. It's simply an external. It's even organized that way. It's under the command ultimately of the Al-Quds structure inside Iran. This is an Iranian unit, basically.
It's a foreign legion.
It's a foreign legion, exactly.
What is the hesitation? What is the conceptual roadblock?
Well, I think the conceptual roadblock is that if you look at the Houthis right now and you look at Hamas, the Al-Jabari's forces in the Hamas, and you look at Hezbollah, and if you acknowledge that they're basically Iranian divisions, then you have to admit you're at war with Iran. And there are consequences to that. It's something the West doesn't want to admit. It doesn't want, it keeps trying to maintain this fiction that they aren't at war with Iran. And I think that's the source of the problem.
That is the source of the, I mean, Iran has been at war with the United States since 1979.
Yes.
And now we're in 2021. 42 years later, America is still in denial about it.
Correct.
Because why? I mean, what do you gain from denying it? It just gets worse, as we're seeing now. They're weeks away from independent nuclear military capability.
Because the policy implications are that if we're at war with them and they do certain things, then you really have to respond to it. And then you go up against the will and the lack of will in the West to confront Iran. So if you admit they're at war with you and you see they're building a weapon, a nuclear weapon, and you begin to realize diplomacy won't solve it, which is something we should have known from the beginning.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, Iran is about violating international law. So an agreement under international law doesn't mean anything to them. So the very essence of an agreement with Iran is useless. But if you admit that, and you admit that they're an enemy at war, actively at war with you, which, by the way, Iran doesn't hide.
No.
Then when you see them developing a weapon, you know that when push comes to shove, you have to act. And that's not the...
Of course, you know, the time to act was in 2003, 2004,
yes,
when it would have been very easy to kill it in the bud. And it was at that time, you know, you worked with Cheney, you worked with Rumsfeld. I'll never forget it. And we're digressing and we have to go back. But there was, I think it was while I was still in Iraq, that Rumsfeld, they realized that Saddam had moved his chemical weapons into Syria before the United States invaded. And he said something about hot pursuit. I may be getting it a little bit wrong, but this is in my memory. And then, like, you blink your eyes and Colin Powell, then Secretary of State, was in Damascus embracing Bashar Assad as a partner.
Yeah.
And the message was so obvious that absolutely not over my dead body. We're going to say that these borders are inviolate, that we're not going to go anywhere, that we broke the Pottery Barn rule. You know, we're in Iraq. We're not allowed to do anything else. And it was sort of like from the outset, the North Vietnam and Cambodia thing. Like, you can't go past the rat line. You can't stop the supply. You can't stop, they were all coming from Syria and Iran, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's like the old Viet Cong. Was it not, or was it part of the North Vietnamese army? You see, there was a big debate before the Iraq War. Whatever happened in executing the Iraq War and not going further with Iran is one thing. But before the war, after 9/11, there was a very big debate, which was, what is the nature of terrorism? And Colin Powell, Richard Armitage, and others, their basic point was that it was a non-governmental actor. Terrorism should be treated like a crime. And as a non-governmental actor, you need governments to help you fight them. So they saw, and then they lived under this illusion that secular terrorists don't work with religious terrorists, et cetera, et cetera.
And Sunnis and Shiites don't work together.
Sunnis and Shiites don't work together, et cetera, et cetera.
But they could have used the laws of piracy, which they refused to use also, right? I mean, there were a lot of things.
They also did that, but the most important thing that this led to was they saw Libya, Syria, and Iran potentially as an ally in fighting terrorism and al-Qaeda. Whereas the rest of us said, you know, al-Qaeda is like the PLO with Nasser. It became the language through which all these governments were executing terrorism. Iran had part of al-Qaeda. Right. There were serious Iranian assets involved with al-Qaeda. There were Iraqi, in honesty, less than Iran. There were already the beginnings of some Syrian elements in al-Qaeda. What should one day come out is how extensive there were Libyan elements of it with the Saif al-Islam and some of the groups in Saudi Arabia and so forth. But the bottom line was, Colin Powell and the British were pushing internally in the U.S. government this idea that the war on terrorism, because this was not a governmental issue, demanded peace process with the Palestinians and demanded coming to terms with Syria and Iran. And
the conceptual link that they made was what?
The conceptual link they made was that they were as threatened by these terrorists as we were, and that again under.
But how could they come to the idea that Osama bin Laden or Khomeini or anybody were fighting in Iraq and in Saudi and all over the globe, really, because of Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria and Israeli control over Jerusalem? I mean, that's like
what it is if they felt like
that's blaming the Jews.
So they felt we have a problem with Al Qaeda. So for them, this was never a war on terrorism or war. And by the way, the United States really, even in 2005, we were trying to figure out debate strategy. We were in a war for 4 years without a strategy. What happened was if you see the Ba'athist regime in Syria as a secular Arab nationalist government, and oh God, they will never work with Al Qaeda, and there's evidence they did, and a Sunni Ba'athist regime in Iraq, and they will never work with Al Qaeda, and they did to some extent.
Well, they became Al Qaeda in Iraq,
right? Exactly, and then you had the same thing with Iran. Oh, they're Shiites; they would never work with the Sunni. So all of a sudden you say, well, we need to come to terms with them. But there's a big problem. We can't come to terms with Syria unless the Israelis give up the Golan Heights. And we can't come to terms with the PLO, which is secular in their mind. It never was secular. But that was the idea, that this secular Arab nationalism was our ally against this religious terrorism. So it drove these people like Colin Powell to be desperate about coming to terms with these Arab nationalist movements.
So what is so odd about that, and what's so odd about that, and maybe we'll just leave it there and then go back to Lebanon for a second, but what's so odd about that is that all of these discussions were taking place after the peace process collapsed because Arafat rejected statehood in July 2000 and went to war. So that, the offer had already been made by Clinton in December 2000, by Barack in July 2000 at Camp David, and then in subsequent months. It had already been made. Everything that they said was the key to everything had already been given, and it didn't open that door. I mean, there was nothing, it had already failed. Their whole conceptual model of the Middle East had failed, and it didn't fail, it wasn't ancient history, it's time to try it again. It was the day before yesterday, and there was terror in the streets of Israel that entire time. So that doesn't make any sense.
Well, what happened was, at the end of the day, it was precisely because it failed so catastrophically, they couldn't walk away. What happened was, so you had an elite who had for 20 years argued, starting with the Venice Accord in 1979 with the European elites, which then spread easily to the United States' elites, that the Palestinian issue really is, they accepted essentially Arafat's formulation of the problem, that it's the basic problem in the region. You can't get beyond it. You can't have regional peace until the Palestinian issue is solved. So really the entire Middle East policy establishment in Europe and in America became deeply invested over 2 generations in resolving the peace process in the Palestinian issue. The worst thing they had going for them was what made it such a laboratory. Rarely in history do you get a laboratory perfect application of a theory. But the Oslo process was. The Soviet Union had collapsed, so the PLO was without mentor. The Israelis had, essentially won, but the Israelis gave in on their own and said, let's recognize the PLO, essentially admitting that they're going to allow a Palestinian state to be created. Right. So this was everything everybody had said for 20 years, if only, if only, if only. And they got their laboratory perfect application of that, and it catastrophically failed.
Right. So why didn't they let go?
Well, because they found a way not to admit failure. The way is, there were enemies of peace. Well, if only Rabin hadn't been killed. If only there aren't Hamas and the Iranians. And then the Iranians sort of became a boogeyman for the peace process failure. These are Hamas's Iran, and these.
Then it was Iran. Now it's no longer.
Now it's no longer, of course. But you see that's where this whole idea that this religious regional religious terrorism is against Arab nationalism.
Now I have to tell you the truth of the matter is that this is so just insipid it's so stupid that it's hard for me to get around the obvious conclusion, which is that it's about something else completely, which is anti-Semitism, right? Because, I mean, it really is just about saying the Jews are the problem. The Jews are to blame. You know, if we can just get the Jews to act different, then everything will be fine. It's the same idea of the West's constant rejection of the perception of the West and Israel in the eyes of the Arabs. They wouldn't see, you know, Israel this way. I mean, I saw it when in Iraq, it was so irritating or infuriating, which was that, you know, if you wanted to understand what you were getting into when you went into Iraq, then the best place to look for guidance was Israel's war in Lebanon.
Correct.
Because demographically, they're so similar. Right. And if you want to understand the system that you're about to upset, then go to a system that's like it and see. But I said that to one of the officers in the unit that I was with, and he said, but you guys were the occupiers and we're the liberators. Yeah. So that, you know, from the get-go, there was this concept that we can't learn anything from Israel's experience because it's sui generis, because Israelis are the bad guys and we're not like them. When the Arabs, and you know, I read this Marine guy's memoir of the massacre at the Marine barracks. And he was talking about how stunned they were that they go into Beirut and push the Israelis out. And then they received the same treatment as the Israelis, that the Lebanese, all the various groups in Lebanon viewed the Americans as just a replacement for the Israelis. And they were like, but wait, we're here, we're better than the Israelis. And they're like, you're the Israelis.
No, actually, we're worse, because the Israelis, if they were powerful and remembered they were powerful, they could actually be useful for some of these forces in the region who want to survive, and maybe Israel could play some role in surviving. You know, every time you go to Jerusalem, you pass through Abu Ghosh.
Right.
And that was an Arab town. Yeah. Right. And everybody goes and eats hummus there and so forth. And it's part of the Israel that was already since day one of Israel. The reason for it was the tribal leader of the community of Abu Ghosh decided, you know, these Jews are going to win, and they're pretty powerful. So it's in my interest to side with them.
Right.
And if we remember that, actually Israel might have more. You know,
Arafat said about Abu Ghosh, like famous statement by Arafat, which was that he was the first people that he was going to kill when he took over Israel with the people in Abu Ghosh.
But, you know, so if Israel actually thought and acted from the mentality of being a strong country, it actually will find that it is more likely to have regional following than the United States.
Right. So let's go back to Lebanon. So 2000, Israel withdraws, and Hezbollah makes a statement, you know, to the Arab world. Nasrallah basically says, see, we won where you lost. See, Islam is king. We did it right. You did it all wrong. What happened to Hezbollah between May 31st, 2000, when Israel left, and July 2006, when they started attacking Israel in what became the Second Lebanon War, which was really, I think, the first Israel-Iran war?
Is the transformation from a squad-level terrorist organization to an army that still employed terrorism. They didn't give up on that old structure, but it was an army. It was essentially the forward units of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, or Islamic Revolution Guard, so IRGC. So that's the transformation. And you then started seeing across the region training of other terrorists in Mashhad in Iran and elsewhere the same way. So you really began to create a threat to Israel. The other thing is, in Israel, I think there's a very, as used to be very, I did my PhD and I studied very carefully the Israeli military evolution. I thought it was a very brilliant idea that the Israelis had a different concept for what they call bitachon shotaf and bitachon bsisi. Bitachon bsisi, which is basic security, is something that will come and kill you as a nation. It will destroy you as a nation, like an invading army.
Right.
And bitachon shotaf is there's a terrorist bomb planted in a market somewhere. And that's sort of categorized it as an irritant. What I don't think was ever appreciated is these are not different things. In the Middle Eastern way of war, that current security, or bitachon shotaf, that planting the bomb in the market, is a strategy that eventually leads to a basic security threat. So Israel.
Well, I think that I understand what you're saying, but I think that what you're pointing to is something else, which is that Israeli military thinkers have a problem with understanding the difference between tactics and strategy.
Correct.
And as a result, they often have a tactical viewpoint that they glorify as a strategic viewpoint. So they can't understand that. Obviously, if you look at the difference between how Israel is able to cordon off an area and limit the security threats to, say, what happened in Nice on Bastille Day a couple of years ago when 81 people died when they were rammed by a truck. That would never have happened in Israel because we have the tactical doctrine for protecting an enclosed area.
Yeah. And very good at it.
But that's not strategy. That's a way of dealing with a discrete kind of threat.
Correct. But for the Muslim side, for the Islamic side, it is a strategy.
Right.
And when you look at the transformation,
because it's talking about breaking down a society,
right? So you see the transformation of Hezbollah, or the transformation of Hamas over the period of the last 20, 30 years. It was never appreciated that this was all part of a strategic assault designed to destroy Israel. This is not over borders. This is not whatever issue they thought. This is a war to destroy Israel, and therefore deterrence and acts of deterrence are inappropriate to think about or at least the way we think of it is inappropriate to think about. So the transformation exposed what the real essence was of Hezbollah, but it also radically transformed its capabilities. So when you get down to it, this was the failure of I think it's a big reflection of the failure of Israel's security establishment, traditional security establishment.
So that gets us really to July of 2006. So Israel had just been fighting in Judea and Samaria in Operation Defensive Shield when it retook the population centers in the Palestinian Authority to end their operation as mass terror bases that were exporting suicide bombers to Israeli population centers on a daily basis. So Israel had just had some very significant success in handling that. But then they get into Lebanon in 2006, and they're beset by a completely different structure and level of threat and armaments that they were ill-prepared for, ill-equipped to deal with, both psychologically and militarily.
Well, I think this came out of the peace process. I think there was a real feeling that Israel will not fight any more wars, that Oslo removed from the template of potential threats. There was the nuclear threat from Iran. There was terrorism threat, but there wasn't any more the conventional threat to Israel. That was
this was but Hezbollah is a hybrid conventional threat in the sense that you don't have armored divisions, you don't have Air Force, you have all of these things that are kind of complementary. They're directed directly at blowing up Israeli stuff, right? They're not about. It's like an army that was built around just destroying an army, right?
Exactly, but it was an army on army thing, and that's what Israel had removed from its mindset, that there will be another war. So defense spending was reduced. Major military programs were abandoned. For example, there were answers to the Coronet missiles against tanks that could have been deployed by the time of the 2006 war. But there was a strategic decision.
We don't need it anymore.
We don't need it because the next war is going to be God knows when, if ever. And so let's put our money elsewhere. Let's either take it away from defense or put it in research, which I'm not against research, but the opposite. I think the Israelis are very good at research, but the bottom line is they had a real threat and they needed to address it, and they just didn't think that it was real. It was a failure on the level of the 73 war. The concept failed. You even had Shimon Peres out there saying Israel shouldn't waste its precious territory for things like infrastructure. That's what Arab territory could be used for. Israel could put its airport in Jordan. Because there are not going to be any more wars. So why do you have to think militarily and territorially?
Well, that was the other thing. That was the other thing. I mean, that I was waiting for you to get to it, which was that between 2000 and 2006, Hezbollah became the sole controller, really the sovereign in South Lebanon.
Yes.
And so they controlled that territory. Before 2000, we controlled, I mean, we didn't do a good job of it, but we blocked that from happening.
Yeah.
And when we left, Hezbollah just took over. We began as controlling, and then by the end we kept constricting ourselves. We thought if they can't see us, they won't hit us anymore. But at least we were there.
Yeah.
But once we were gone, they just took over all of the villages in South Lebanon.
Completely.
And so that was the other thing that it was like people just weren't paying any attention, right?
Well, they weren't paying attention to that. And this is a big thing you're mentioning here, because it also came after Oslo. Israel, in the span of 5 years, abandoned hundreds, if not thousands, of its allies across the line. And the signal was sent, don't be an Israeli ally, don't be an agent, don't work with Israel, you will pay. And so you have to link the withdrawal from Lebanon and the impact of that with the withdrawal from Judea and Samaria in 1993, 4, 5, 6, and the massive slaughter internally of agents and friends and allies of Israel. This was a very important breakdown. And I think Israel suffered from an intelligence point of view horribly after this, which then had the added on effect of being blind for way too much. You're
talking about both vis-a-vis the Palestinians and vis-a-vis the Lebanese.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I just remember I was interviewing the South Lebanese Army veterans it was in 2000, the summer of 2000, and they were having a rally, a demonstration, a protest in Tel Aviv outside of the city hall there. And I was talking to them, I was interviewing them for the paper, talking to them, and they were impassioned. We gave blood. We gave you our blood when they blew up your paratroopers in Sur, in Sidon. And you are our brothers. We fought side by side with you. So even if we thought, they're mercenaries, they're whatever, whatever the commanders were thinking about them, they didn't think of themselves that way. No. And they didn't think of us that way. And we never saw them through their eyes. We never saw ourselves through their eyes. And, these were spurned allies, and they felt so angry. And it was the same thing that we did with these Palestinians. We called them collaborators as opposed to, spies or agents, and like there's something very tawdry about being a collaborator. We're your enemy. You're not supposed. So we also demeaned them. I was working in the Army. I was working on we built up a unit to help resettle collaborators. But it was this concept that there was something morally compromised about people who were working with us to prevent terrorist attacks. And again, it's like this idea that we're not worth anything. We're not important here. We're in the wrong, which is a very leftist Israeli way of looking at things, of embracing this idea that Israel is the problem. So the smaller we are,
Yeah, I mean, the use of the word collaborator, these were the agents of the Nazis in World War II. That's where that word gained its connotation.
Yeah. Coco Chanel.
Yeah, I mean, so to employ that already revealed the idea that the Israeli left, who wanted to withdraw, looked at themselves as an evil occupying force in the cradle of Jewish civilization.
So in 2006, we go to war. We're flying blind. We don't understand the enemy. We don't understand enemy society. In a way, we learned everything the Americans wouldn't learn from us. And then we forgot everything, that we had learned. And we went in there as if we had never been there before. Correct. And what happened? What happened in the Bush administration? How... I saw it from my perspective in the Jerusalem Post. You saw it from your perspective in the White House.
What we didn't understand was that the American sickness had affected Israel. And by that, I mean that there were no wars with victories anymore. the Vietnam War in America was the first war we fully lost because we decided victory wasn't really an option. Wars don't result in victories. So what happened with Israel was they had that mentality, but we in the United States still looked at Israel the other way. We thought Israel was still the traditional concept of war. And so when the war began inside the Bush administration, specifically Vice President Cheney, a number of others, they understood this to be a strategic event vis-a-vis Iran. If you remember, Syria had been kicked out of Lebanon at that point, and Hezbollah was somewhat in trouble. And there was a debate within Hezbollah.
This was after Hariri was murdered in 2005.
And the March 8th movement and so forth. And Hezbollah, basically, you could see that many of them were scared. And they were saying, well, these Israelis can be crazy. And if we do anything, they'll destroy us. And the Iranians turned around and they said, you're destroyed anyway. I mean, you're finished. Your position in Lebanon is finished. Unless we change the strategic perception in the region. So your survival, ironically, is contingent on you falling on your sword to make Iran look like the powerful future force. And then that will redound back to Lebanon and reestablish your position there. Otherwise, you're in a linear path to destruction. So the Iranian view of Hezbollah won over those few local commanders who were scared. And they went to war. The United States understood this. Cheney and Elliott Abrams and others understood this as a major strategic event, and that it was imperative that Israel be given the room to win.
Right.
Our assumption was Israel's going to win and go for the jugular. We waited and we waited and we waited. And I hate to say it, but we concocted all sorts of ways to keep Condoleezza Rice busy and so forth, to keep her out of the picture because she didn't see this way. How many weeks? I forgot, 40 days, 45
like
days.
33 days.
33 days. This went on and there was no victory and there was no victory. And the Israelis went in, came out, went in, came out, went in, came out. And in the end, it undermined the camp inside the U.S. government that was tough on Iran, saw the need for a series, really a campaign to make Iran.
Did you ever have any conversations? I mean, what you were saying about Israel and the way that we saw things and how Oslo, how Oslo impacted or blinded us to strategic realities, or the thinking that brought Oslo was itself blindness, and then it continued to pervade our top military echelons and also strategic. So, Olmert had given this speech to the Israel Policy Forum where he said, we're tired of fighting, we're tired of winning, which was stunning.
Yeah.
But he knew. He had run in 2006 a campaign to reenact the withdrawal from Gaza in Judea and Samaria. And he was talking about, expelling 100,000 Jews from their homes. And so for him, he was in a bind, right? Because he had this plan to withdraw from territory. The attacks that we had received just a couple weeks before Hezbollah began to strike. I said it started in Gaza with Gilad Shalit was kidnapped and then the bombing and everything.
Exactly.
So it actually started in Gaza. They were already proving just months after the withdrawal that it was a complete strategic catastrophe. And he wanted to continue it in Judea and Samaria. Then comes Hezbollah, in the first place we withdrew from, proving yet again what a disaster it would be if we left. But he was stuck politically in a bind, because if he actually recognized that he had to control the territory that had been seized by Hezbollah over 6 years in order to win, then he would have had to renounce everything that he had come to embody and, to embrace as his strategic vision for a smaller, more compact Israel that could be tired of fighting and tired of winning.
Well, in Iran and Hezbollah, those who were wanting to go to war, knew that. That's exactly what they expected. So
they understood Israel.
They understood Israel because Israel said that's what it was. The Israelis weren't hiding the fact under Olmert and others that they essentially had given up on controlling territory, and they were just please build a wall, let me be on the other side of it. And they knew that Israel wasn't. So if Israel is about to withdraw from more area in the West Bank, the last thing that Israel could countenance is reoccupying part of Lebanon. This was the whole essence of what Balin and the withdrawal from South Lebanon. It was a catastrophe. So they couldn't reoccupy. And Hezbollah knew it. Iran knew it. So they knew whatever would happen in the war, that's replaceable. It's equipment. People are replaceable for Hezbollah too. So they knew whatever cost they have, the one thing that they would come out of this knowing is that the Israelis do not have the will to pay the price of winning a war.
You're in Cheney's national security staff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you guys are watching this. And Elliot Abrams is pushing Condoleezza Rice into giving her busy work in something totally different so that she won't be coming in with, the Colin Powell policy of withdrawal. Did you talk to the Israelis?
Yes.
What happened?
We were. And first of all, Condoleezza Rice was talking to the Israelis.
Well, she was talking to Livni.
She was talking to Tzipi Livni, and therein started a big problem, which was in every cabinet meeting in the United States, you heard the line, but the Israelis don't want to win. The Israelis they want us to save them and impose a ceasefire.
So what was Tzipi Livni telling her?
Tzipi Livni was turning around to her cabinet and saying, the Americans want a ceasefire and they want it now. And this was Condi and Tzipi Livni. This wasn't actually the policies of, I don't know if it wasn't the policy of Olmert, but it certainly was not the policy of President Bush and Vice President Cheney. We wanted Israel to win. And we were not willing to stop Israel. We were the opposite. We wanted to give Israel whatever room it needed to have to win. And so what Tzipi Livni was telling her government that the United States is trying to impose a ceasefire.
Was Olmert talking to Bush?
Might have been talking to Condoleezza Rice, but that was not the U.S. government position.
Was Olmert talking to Bush about this?
He might have been, and maybe he expressed himself to Bush the idea that, I don't know what Olmert basically told Bush, but at the end of the day, the signal was sent very clearly: Israel doesn't have the will to win. And this had a major effect on the American government because afterwards, in the very first cabinet level meeting following it, Condoleezza Rice made the very strong point that you see, even the great power of the Israeli army can deliver no victory. It can't. Military force doesn't work. You have to address root causes.
And what are the root causes?
And you know what? I remember there was a conversation between Prime Minister Blair of Britain, and Bush. And Blair at one point basically told Bush, the Iranians are getting close. I got to start knowing what are your intentions here with Iran. And Bush said, there's some of those in our group, in our cabinet, who are pushing for war. But as we learned in Iraq and in Lebanon, force doesn't solve anything. So right then and there,
what year was that?
This was 2006, 2007. For those of us on the inside, it was clear the United States will not take military action to stop Iran, and which means they're not willing to stop Iran because there's no other way to stop them in the end of the day.
And then you had the National Intelligence Estimate in November 2007.
And I'm not saying that there weren't people in the U.S. government who were still saying that you must do that and hoping that somehow they could prevail on President Bush. But the truth is, because of the 2006 war, the internal balance of power in the U.S. government shifted toward Condoleezza Rice fully and toward the idea that use of force in the Middle East causes more trouble than it's worth.
So that really brings us to where we are today, right? Because now, fast forward 15 years.
Yep.
So we left that war and basically Hezbollah won. Because Israel achieved none of its military objectives. And from then on, Hezbollah has just become more and more and more and more powerful. Yeah. And now they have 150,000 missiles.
It showed everybody that Israel wasn't willing to pay the price of winning. And that was the signal sent to Hamas. To this day, Israel lives under the shadow of that perception. Correctly on some level, that Israel isn't willing to win in Gaza. It isn't willing to win against even the PLO and the...
Look, in a way, I kind of agree with the concept of not winning in Gaza in the sense that when you have people saying, well, what we really want is to bring the PLO back into Gaza, you're better off just keeping them separate. So, well, you got two different Palestinian entities, and what sort of state would you want, and what are you talking about? From a political perspective, it's much easier for Israel with Hamas in charge, but obviously not with the kind of firepower that they're able to bring to bear.
Again, it's the basic. Again,
here, there's only a military strategy.
There is a bigger failure, which is the idea that somehow you can build a wall and go away. So if Gaza isn't under Hamas, well, we got to find somebody else to put it under. And I think the Gaza war 2 months ago told us one thing, which is positive control of the territory. From the Jordan all the way to the Mediterranean. How the politics of that inside is worked out is another question, but the positive control under the Israeli army is essential. There cannot be military forces operating in those regions, whether it's Hamas or the PLO, and yet have Israeli security. It's impossible. So true victory wasn't to destroy Hamas and turn it over to the PLO. The true victory is to start over. That essentially Israel had to go back to the conceptions of 2005, go back to the conceptions of Oslo, and come to terms with the fact that the whole concept of Oslo, of finding a beholden Arab force, turning it over to them in a sign of weakness, and giving them their aspirations as if we were in the wrong, and demonstrating along the way that Israel has no will for victory, that's a disaster. And that's what's really so last week,
Hezbollah, Hamas attacked Israel with thousands of missiles in May, and was given hundreds of millions of dollars in reconstruction pledges from the U.S., from the EU, from the UN, from Qatar, and from Egypt. All of these countries. Hezbollah attacks Israel with 20 missiles. And the United States gives us $100 million in aid. Where are we now? 15 years later, there was a fight. Condi won. Then you had Obama. You had a little bit of Trump. And now you're back with Obama, with Biden. And what?
It's deja vu all over again.
But with much more powerful weapons.
Much more powerful weapons and more dangerous enemies. But the concept is the same, and it failed. And the concept, there are other ideas that were involved here, secular nationalism and so on and so on. The bottom line is that there is a fundamental belief that Israel has to pay a pound of flesh in order to make peace on the Palestinian issue, which then allows the United States to have proper relations with the rest of the Arab world. The fundamental idea is that the Zionist enterprise has to be balanced against the Arab enterprise. And if you go back to the historical record of 1919 onwards, it is not actually valid. Namely, the consistent attempts to appease Arab nationalism at the expense of Zionism actually led to a greater period of anti-Westernism, whether it's the British with Hajj al-Husseini or the White Paper. The historical record is actually 100% consistent.
It's crazy.
And yet the concept is the opposite, that you have to balance it, and balancing it means you have to take a pound of flesh from the Israelis and give it to the Arabs. And that the reason why it doesn't work is because the Arabs look at Israel as part of the West.
I don't think that's the only reason.
There is anti-Semitism too. I can't deny it. Look, I always point to the issue of Jerusalem. The West has this attitude of Jerusalem, well, it's Muslim. East Jerusalem's Muslim. Well, I don't know a single Muslim in the world that considers the Temple Mount the first or second holiest place of Islam. Really, they don't consider it holy at all. But I don't really know a Jew who thinks that the Temple Mount is not at the top of the list.
But it's not just that. I was thinking, you were talking about Hajj al-Husseini. So, I wrote about this in my book, The Israeli Solution, because it's so stunning, right? The British sided with this terrorist, who's Arafat's, godfather or whatever. And tried to destroy the Jewish political entity in pre-state Israel in order to appease him. Blocked Jewish immigration from Europe under Nazi control, essentially acting as Hitler's silent partner by blocking any avenue of escape for the Jews, and even trying to block them from coming to America and everywhere else. Absolutely. And so the British were very much the junior partners in the genocide, and they did this to appease Husseini, who then went and became, first he incited a Nazi revolution in Iraq, right? That they had to bring in soldiers. I thought he did that in Lebanon.
No, you're right.
In Lebanon, yes, but they had to fight a war in Iraq in the middle of World War II to bring down this Nazi government, and then in Iran as well. And so and then he incited the entire Arab world as a Nazi from Berlin on shortwave radio throughout. So that they did this.
He was also so impressed with the gas chambers, he actually sent a unit to help.
So all I was going to say was that actually it's not West, right? It's something specific, Anglo-American. It's Judeo-Christian because they liked the Nazis. You know, the Arab youth groups, they styled themselves after the Hitler, the Hitler Youth, and they wore their uniforms and they liked the Nazis. And the Nazis
Fascism was heavily based on it.
And the Nazis are Westerners, right? They're from Europe. So it's not exactly West. It's Jewish, it's Judeo-Christian if you want, but I mean, it's a specific kind of West, right?
It's a specific kind of West. That's exactly it. It's the West that was anchored to the British evolution, the American Revolution. It's a liberal nationalist West. Not in the modern sense of liberalism, classic liberal nationalism.
Yeah, John Stuart Mill. Nationalism of George Washington.
And it was a Renaissance. It was really a Renaissance view. Right. I mean, it's really the American Revolution is sort of the culmination of the Renaissance. Right. Not necessarily as much the Enlightenment as the Renaissance. But anyway, that's what they were going after. The same place communism was going after it. Nazism was going after it. The Islamic world, whether it's based on ideologies influenced by the Nazis or Islamic forces,
the Muslim Brotherhood,
Sayyid Qutb and so forth, this was the enemy. This was the real enemy. It was that brand of politics they hated the most.
And so now we're looking at the Americans, and to a degree, the Israeli government, which doesn't have any strategic concept today at all, right? And so they fundamentally cannot understand, their brain cannot compute, will not compute kind of thing. They cannot understand at all Lebanon, right?
No.
And it's just a disaster waiting to happen. In fact, it's already happening.
I mean, look, they believe in deterrence, which doesn't work against Hezbollah. They believe that there's a Lebanese government you can lean on to rein in Hezbollah. They don't understand Lebanon doesn't exist.
Right.
It is nothing more than a fiction to allow Hezbollah domination of that piece of territory and to suck it dry, using the state institutions to literally, like a vacuum cleaner, suck all the assets and money out of the country to sustain the Iranian revolution. So, to look at Lebanon as an independent country, it reminded me, it's like trying to threaten the Polish government in the Cold War with nuclear incineration if the Soviets hit us. They were nothing but a minion, that government. It was the Soviets we were dealing with in Poland, Czechoslovakia. It wasn't indigenous.
So what has to happen in order to actually deal with this? You just have to deal with it. Right?
Well, in terms of Lebanon specifically, to deal with it, I think, unfortunately, the governmental structures are so compromised that you have to essentially start over. One has to look at it like Europe after World War II. Where you had
I don't know why after World War II, it seems to me that it's very much Nazi occupied.
Europe, and that is like, for example.
No, I think it's France in 1943, not France in 1945.
Oh, you mean Lebanon, that Israel, or the United States?
No, I'm saying that saying that you have to reconstruct Lebanon as if it's Germany in 1945 misses the point that actually it's not, because the Nazis are still in charge.
Right. Okay. No, okay. What I meant was that when we went into Japan and we went into Germany, we dismantled the government structures.
Right.
We realized we had to start over in those countries.
So what we're really saying is that there's no diplomatic solution. No. There's only a military problem right now.
There's no, because who are you going to engage with? Anything you deal with that is called the Lebanese government right now is a tentacle of Hezbollah.
Right.
And they're not going to change.
So I think that if we want to end this conversation, with some, aside from the analysis, with some sort of a prescription, I think it's to take what Condoleezza Rice said at the end of the Lebanon War and turn it on its head.
Yes.
That actually military force wasn't properly implemented or used in 2006, much as it was not used properly in 2005 in Iraq. And that you don't replace a failed military strategy with a failed diplomatic strategy, which is even less connected to reality than a failed military strategy was. You replace a failed military concept with a successful one, right?
Right, exactly. And it starts with the concept of victory. Victory causes, it triggers regional dynamics that help the victor. The Middle East doesn't reward losers, doesn't reward those who compromise and give away. It's a sign of weakness. At the end of the day, it rewards victors. So if Israel, the United States, give up the concept of victory, they've given up any hope of working with anybody in the region. They've given up the hope of having any proper relationship with anybody around them. The UAE did not sign an agreement with Israel because it thought it was a great compromiser. It signed with Israel because it thought it was powerful and knew that it was powerful and was willing to stand up even to the United States to do what it had to do on Iraq.
You know, that really just points, and maybe this will be my last remark, and then I'm going to give you the last word. It points, though, to the brilliance, maybe unplanned, but the brilliance of the Trump-Netanyahu partnership, in the sense that they actually didn't win any military victories. What they won was a conceptual victory.
Correct.
And just having that concept that we're going to crush anybody who messes with us, and we're going to build all these partnerships and empower allies, was sufficient to get allies. Yeah. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. I mean, look, they had simple concepts, which was allies are better friends than enemies. And, very simple, but no administration got that before.
Well, be good to your friends and bad to your enemies.
Exactly. But they also understood the dynamics of the region. UAE had a threat. It had Turkey, but it really had Iran right next to it. They were scared to death. They were worried America wasn't going to do what they need to do. So they were desperately looking for the strong horse who they could align with. And Israel's there. And that's the dynamic that Netanyahu brought to the table and instigated, not only under Trump, even before, but it really finally came to fruition under Trump because he had somebody in the White House who understood this. And that fundamentally transformed the region. That's something the Iranians, the Turks could never digest and could never counter. And the Russians couldn't counter it because they can't. There's nothing you can do. Israel's powerful. And the United States is powerful. If they remember that, then there's nothing that can't be done.
All right. Well, let us hope that people are listening and that Israelis realize that power is not a bad thing. It's a good one. And we want to be more powerful, not less. And so should the United States. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys. I'm going back to Israel next week. And I'll see you in my bunker. And it was great seeing you, David. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Carolyn.
All right. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Bye.